So good evening and welcome everyone. A very warm welcome to this special lecture from the Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, which is part of the Institute of Historical Research here in the School of Advanced Study, University of London. And it's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful room, the Chancellor's Hall at the heart of Senate House. I'm Professor Catherine Clark and I'm the Director of our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community. We're absolutely delighted to have Dr. Andrew Rumsey with us this evening for this wonderful lecture on Another Country, How the English Parish Shaped a Nation. And I'm going to introduce Andrew properly in a moment. I wanted to tell you that this evening's lecture is the culmination of a very special day for one of the projects based in our Centre for the History of People, Place and Community, and that's the Victoria County History of England. The Victoria County History, or VCH, was founded in 1899 and dedicated to Queen Victoria. That's how it gets its name. Its continuing mission is to write the history of every place in England, from the earliest times to the present day. It's one of the longest running and most prestigious research projects in the world, today driven by expert historians, both professional and teams of volunteers, working in and on their own local communities. So today we've brought together VCH participants from across the country to do some business, but also to celebrate our unique project, which continues to help us understand more about our places, their past stories and their future potential. We're always keen to involve new contributors, so do have a chat if you might be interested, and there's lots of our VCH materials on a table you'll find at the back of the hall. The VCH is sometimes described as a national local history project, and the building blocks of VCH history begin always with the parish as the smallest unit. So Andrew Rumsey's work and his lecture tonight are of enormous interest to us as we think about the relationship between the parish and wider histories and identities, and as we reflect, as we do so often, on exactly what that idea of England in our title might mean. And of course, those questions around identity, community, place and belonging have a far wider resonance and urgency today across politics, across public life, across our shared imagination. So it's an absolute joy to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Andrew Rumsey, Bishop of Ramsbury. Andrew is author of several books, including Parish, an Anglican theology of place, and his recent work, English Grounds, a pastoral journal, described as a total delight by Simon Jenkins. I've also read both books, and they were indeed a total delight. Andrew's writing specialises in themes of landscape, place, and heritage, all of which feed into his role as national lead for church buildings and cathedrals in the Church of England. Andrew has kindly agreed to take some questions at the end of his lecture, which I'm sure will spark lots of lively discussion. And you're also all invited, if you're able to, at the end, to join us and to stay for some drinks and nibbles. We're delighted to have you with us, Andrew, so I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you. Good evening, everybody. How lovely to be with you. I'm honoured to be present tonight in this beautiful session on a glorious day in London, and having been indebted at many points over the years to the VCH for just the precise bit of local information I needed, as many of us have been, it really is an honour to be present with you. And there could scarcely be a more appropriate week in which to consider these themes. We didn't plan this coincidence with the coronation, but here we are this evening. And in Salisbury Cathedral on Sunday at our civic service, along with MPs, chief constables and high sheriffs of various hues, we sang the following words: I vow to thee, my country, all earthly things above, entire and whole and perfect, the service of my love, the love that asks no question, the love that stands the test, that lays upon the altar the dearest and the best, the love that never falters, the love that pays the price, the love that makes undaunted the final sacrifice. First verse, rather like the national anthem, is the one best known. But of course then the second and final verse comes in, and there's another country I've heard of long ago, most dear to them that love her, most great to them that know. And it continues, soul by soul, and silently her shining bounds increase, and her ways are ways of gentleness, and all her paths are peace. Well, this imaginative tension between the nation, albeit a fairly martial and partial version of it, and an idealized heavenly home, has been a spark plug for local and national identity over the centuries, but has receded so swiftly that it is hard now either to express or understand, being to many of us either unsupportable or simply baffling, or both. And as the coronation displayed so vividly, we are in yet another country now. But I suggest we can neither understand the former one fully, nor progress confidently into the next without grasping what has gone before and using it to some extent as a lamp upon the road ahead. I want to do this evening by dwelling not on high state ceremonial, of which we may have had our fill over the last few days, but by homing in on what Walter Bagehot called, rather enticingly, local holiness that resides at the centre of the English Constitution. So not an antidote to coronation, friends, but maybe a counterpoint to it, because I find the local to be a more revealing index, or scale perhaps, of national identity, as I suspect many of us do. My academic background is a mixture of history and geography and theology, with doctoral research into the question, what kind of place is the English parish, which could have run to several volumes. On my father's side, I'm a fifth generation parish priest, stretching back over nearly 200 years, so that we have communion blood coursing through our veins. And on my mother's side, for at least the same period, my family are rural farm labourers from Lincolnshire who experienced the parish on the receiving end, shall we say, in a rather different way. They received both its welfare and, at times, significantly its oppression. In the South Country, the poet Edward Thomas wrote, "Someday there will be a history of England written from the point of view of one parish." Well, it's still being written, as Catherine was telling us earlier on. And so I want to begin in one parish I know very well, where I served for 10 years, in fact, as local vicar, parish in South London, Crystal Palace, SE19, along one road of which, Church Road, in the summer of 1560, May 1560, the vicar of Croydon, because parishes were slightly bigger in London in those days, Reverend Richard Finch, set out along his rogation-tide perambulation, beating of the parish bounds. This marked the culmination of a long-standing territorial dispute between what were known as the Croydon men and the Penge men over the precise location of their respective parish boundary. During their perambulation of the bounds, Finch, a man of not very determined character, one local historian relates rather enjoyably, encountered the equivalent party from Penge and, wisely in my experience of Penge, decided to back down following aggressive accusations of trespass, thereby conceding to them a significant pocket of land which remains the borough boundary to this day, along which Church Road runs. Further details aside, two features of this case are particularly noteworthy. Firstly, that the practical peculiarity of five, would you believe, 5 London boroughs converging at the end of Church Road is, local historian Alan Warwick wrote, to some extent the outcome of the perambulations of a vicar in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I who was not sufficiently resolute. Second, and perhaps of greater interest, is the way in which this particular Church Road, of many hundreds of them, has consistently proved to be a site of social tension and boundary conflict. The borough boundary runs down the middle of the road to the confusion of municipal dust carts. It became something of a front line in the 2011 riots, the summer where I left the parish, and also the site of a notorious planning dispute about the reuse, the conversion of an old cinema by a Pentecostal church, which gained national attention in the media. Consistently, time and time again, this one road has proved to have these repeated patterns, habits of conflict and boundary tension that have rippled out literally across the whole of South London. Recent research by Nicola White and others suggests that this kind of psychogeographic recurrence may not be an isolated example of how the accidents of parish history converge to influence and to some degree explain present-day patterns of social inclusion. In other words, the routes we take now yield an unavoidable harvest in the future. Tudor clergy should, it seems, have been more careful where they walked. Who knows how the routes we have taken this day will have shaped the places we have departed from and arrived at. What ripples will be sent by your absence from there and your presence here this evening? Each of us, as you know, is placemaking all the time in the myriad decisions that shape the routes we take, how we choose to shop, the places we avoid travelling past or through. The desire lines of our own ordinary activity form a certain kind of society. As Doreen Massey, late great Doreen Massey, geographer, wrote, places might be otherwise. And each day we are creating the places that they become. St. Augustine, centuries ago, wrote that community, this was in the City of God, wrote that community is shaped by the common objects of love. Fascinating phrase. The common objects of love. In other words, what we desire in common shapes the kind of community that we end up with. He didn't add that what we loathe or fear in common also creates community, which of course it does. There are mill towns, there are commuter towns, there are communities formed around interest, all kinds of overlapping associations of desire and affection. Perhaps the most important insight of human geography in the last 60 years or so is that space is not so much a static quantity, but something produced by the habits of daily life. It is shaped and altered by human agency. We know that to be true. It is chaotic, it is random, but it's also intentional and deliberate according to our decisions. So social space is constantly being constructed and deconstructed, made and remade, never remaining the same, however much we might want our places to remain the same. Space, therefore, has huge ethical significance. It is not politically or morally neutral. But before we take a step, of course, the way we act locally is shaped consciously or otherwise by our imagination, by where we perceive ourselves to be, and what the social rules of that kind of place are. I've behaved in different ways in the different spaces that I came in to arrive here in the tube train, I behaved according to the customs of the Jubilee line. In the lift at Church House, Westminster, I kept quiet because that's what you do in a lift. When I was in another space, I knew that the rules of engagement were different. Different spaces call for different kinds of social engagement and behaviour. They have a different vocation, so to speak, even the so-called non-places that we inhabit. As someone who spent most of their time, their working life, certainly as a parish priest, which is one particular kind of bounded neighbourhood with a wealth of associations, both secular and religious, I consider myself very often to be in a parish wherever I happen to be. But that brings with it all kinds of assumptions and spectacles, if you like, about where I am. Others view their places differently. In our time, parish, or at least parochial, has become an interesting and contended word, has it not? If I say to you parochial, what are the immediate associations that crop up in your mind? I suspect that they're not entirely positive, small-minded, possibly insular. The drawbridge pulled up. Parochial more than parish, actually, isn't it? The pejorative associations come. And so in the half hour or so remaining this evening, I want to unpack with you some of the meanings of this concentrated, potent little word, which continues to be one of the most resilient, mutable, potential words for community in our language. And in its English form, both civil and ecclesiastical, I might say a little bit about how those two diverged and converged at different points in history. But the parish, I think, has three principal dimensions, which for simplicity's sake, I'm calling nation, neighbourhood, and nature, with apologies for the three N's. It's the preacher in me. First of all, the parish as nation, or in our context here, perhaps a little England. From its origins, the parish has always signified a blend of secular and sacred. In fact, it's important to recognise, as many of you will already know, that the parish was, first of all, rather like ecclesia, from which we get our word ecclesiastical, was a civil political, a secular political word from Greco-Roman civilization, particularly the Roman Empire. And the paroikia were those who literally lived par oikos, beyond or beside the household, those who physically lived just outside of the city walls, or who were not citizens of the Roman Empire, or both. They were the resident alien, the local stranger. They were those who kind of belonged and kind of didn't. They were the paroikia. The church adoption of that phrase, as they did with ecclesia, the public assembly or the local government essentially, was a deliberately, we assume, and provocatively political statement that we are the new government. We are we are also, in the parochial sense, we are the community of those who sort of belong within the empire and sort of don't. We are resident aliens. We're on the way, after all, they believed, to a better place, and they were sojourners in the land. They had no lasting city in this place, as Scripture puts it. So the early church adopted at some point, and I'd love to hear from you if you know more about this. It's very hazy in the first 3 centuries. The earliest references to parish and church government I found are really not earlier than about 300 AD. But the word is mentioned in the New Testament. I went for years in local ministry as a vicar without believing that the word parish didn't crop up in Scripture. It's actually ascribed to Christ at one point in the resurrection appearances, where on the evening of Easter Day in Luke chapter 24 along the Emmaus Road, 2 strangers walking along the risen Christ draws alongside them and says, what are you talking about as you walk along? And they say to him, are you a paroikeis, that you don't know what's happened here today? That you don't know what's happened here? Are you some kind of local stranger here and not here? Christ the parishioner is quite an interesting idea to conjure with. So the adoption of that phrase, certainly under Roman Christianity, washed ashore on the Kent coast in the late 6th century, as you know, with the Gregorian mission to England. But what did the Roman parish ever do for us? Well, leaping lightly over epochs and centuries, a couple of things to suggest. Firstly, that it gave coherence and a not unproblematic sense of divine providence to the emergence of England as a nation rather than an assortment of rival kingdoms and fiefdoms. As it has done at several key moments in national self-realisation, the 1530s and the 1940s being two other crucial ones, the Church proved surprisingly useful in political terms as a unifying idea, not least because the clerics were literate and they provided an indispensable secretariat to the emerging monarchy. And this growing national coherence in Anglo-Saxon England was accompanied by a growing local coherence as the parish idea gradually extended, often using existing manorial and field boundaries through England, although it wouldn't form anything like a coherent system until around 1200. It took hundreds of years before it extended, and of course it always took in some parts more than in others, and certainly in the southern half of England, the parish was always much more of a system, more systematised, perhaps due to the prevalence of Celtic Christianity in the northern kingdom. The late Patrick Wormel, who's one of the foremost scholars in this area of Anglo-Saxon studies, expressed the Church's role as a kind of national and local binding agent. England, he wrote, was united ecclesiastically well before it was united politically. And so across an extremely long period, and especially again in the early modern scene, the plates of England's emerging landscape were deeply, not solely, shaped by a Christian imagination, which the great chroniclers of the nation, from Gildas to Milton, who was really, I think, the last of those great chroniclers, expressed so clearly. It's perhaps no coincidence that the word parochial was much bandied about in the media post-Brexit, as there is a deep correspondence between parish and nation in this country's social imaginary. Not only in the sense that through long medieval centuries, society was centred around the local church, whether monastically or parochially, but in the way that the emergence of England as a nation was, to some extent at least, underwritten by the parish system, which lent to national life a sacred tone, this idea of blessed plot. Again, Badgett picks it up, local holiness, this combination of earthy local geography with a kind of hallowing. And in return, I might add, endowed Anglicanism with a vital secularity, certainly from my point of view as a church inside of the secularity of Anglicanism is absolutely vital to its existence and balance and needs to be defended. Shared territory that was very carefully negotiated over the weekend. Secondly, and of great importance politically also, the primacy of the parish helped to give the English and to some extent British nationhood a particularly localised form. And this is something I'm really interested in, that the idea of the nation, I want to suggest, prioritises the local over the national. A nation, in other words, is what you end up with in this way of thinking. It's not what you start with, which is what nationalism often gets wrong, if I might suggest that. Nationalism tends to start at the nation and then sort of not impose, but infer to the local. The logic, I suggest, of English polity has been the other way around. It has started from local belonging and extended outwards, so that, as I say, England or Britain is what you end up with. That quality is quite hard to describe, but I think it's been quite an engine for all kinds of things, socially and politically. It comes up we think of it in the local battalions in the Great War and so on, that tenacious hold of the local understanding of being British or being English. Where nationalism asserts, as I say, that scale of belonging first, the radical and, I think, more durable English form, I would argue, has been parochial, so that national belonging is an extrapolation of local identity. I think that makes more geographical sense and more political sense, and it's what Burke is asserting as his antidote to the French Revolution, on his famous reflections on the revolution in France, with his little platoons. Is it little platoons or no platoons? Little platoons. But it's no less radical an idea, I think, and remains a vital feature of our polity and potential resistance to the power of the state when it becomes overweening. There's much more we could say about that. So that's the parish as little nation. Secondly, parish as neighbourhood, and perhaps the cradle of local welfare. By the time our Reverend Finch was setting out on his May Day perambulation of bounds of Croydon and Penge, the parish system was at something of a hinge point in its history. It was becoming, through successive acts of Parliament, the building block of local government. And from the 1530s, as you will know, through dear old Thomas Cromwell, the parish was hit upon under the English Revolution as the way of extending the king's presence and authority in a local way. So the placing of the English Bible in parish churches, the institution in the 1530s of the parish chest, beloved of local historians. We depend upon it. Indeed, that great volume, enduring volume, the parish chest, which some of you have dipped into at many points, and the work of the Webbs and so on, and local historians ever since, has depended on what went in the parish chest, because the registers went in there, among other things. And the institution of that as the beginning of local administration, along with the first of the poor laws, which continued, of course, for over 70 years, and accrued to the parish responsibility for local welfare, a process that really extended over about 200 years. And you get into the 18th century, acquisition of more powers to the parish, the appointment of constables, the care of roads, education, all kinds of things stuck to the parish overseers. The vestry became the molecule from which local government gradually split and grew and changed, particularly in the 19th century. And so the new poor laws of the 1830s and so on were the point at which you get the high, or depending on your opinion, the low point of parish governance, where you have, in Liverpool, you have tens and tens of thousands of people in the new industrial towns in one parish, and you have a creaking vestry trying to care for this colossal community, all looked after by church wardens. And it was utterly unsustainable, deeply oppressive in many ways, always colluded, very often, not always, but often colluded with landed interest. And therefore it never could quite take in the towns, and industrialisation, urbanisation in the 19th century caused this great crisis of conscience, confidence amongst the Anglican elite, leads to the introduction of the census in the 1840s and 50s. because they knew that they didn't belong in the towns and cities in the way that they had in the shires, and of course society was changing more rapidly than they could keep pace with. But the dismantling of parish administration, secular parish administration, from which the city corporations often emerged. And it's fascinating to chart. Many of you will know more about this than I do, but in places like Croydon, particularly, where I've looked at how the parish transitioned to the corporation in 1870s, I think it was there. You get the growth of local civil government in a more recognisable way as it leaves the parish behind, and the 1894 Local Government Act was the critical point where the secular parish and the ecclesiastical parish parted company. So you now have, again, to the confusion of those who are trying to get married in a locality, you've got your parish council, you've got your ecclesiastical parish, and sometimes their boundaries are not the same. Of your school catchment area, it can be very confusing now because they're not coterminous. But it lasted for over 400 years that the ecclesiastical and the civil were the same. But even when my late mother was growing up in the 1930s in Lincolnshire, she could just remember the last workhouses closing, and the inmates became residents. If you go to the Ripon Workhouse Museum, fascinating, wonderful museum, you can see that transition where it became a residential home for the elderly, but a seamless transition from being a workhouse, and literally inmates became residents. And the local settlement, local provision for welfare expanded its horizon to become national settlement, and with the creation of the welfare state, that was now held at the national level rather than at the local level. Now that was a very significant transition, the 1930s, 1940s, that significance of the shift in welfare provision from local to national was a pivotal moment. Frank Pachaska, in his fascinating study, calls that, for the Church of England, the abdication of a historic responsibility. William Temple, of course, was the person who, the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, who coined the phrase welfare state in a lecture in the late 1920s. He was very much involved with Beveridge and others, Tawney, in creating that kind of socialist ideal of the welfare state. But it was a shift, however we view it now. It was a pivotal shift, a necessary one, perhaps. So we can see the parish, the significance of the parish at various points in English local life, deeply written into the practice and experience of neighbourhood. It is the nearby community, of course. Neighbour is nearby, a similar word, the same kind of meaning. It is about space and time. It is about the creation of local ways of life. And as any social historian knows, the local reality was often very far from ideal. If you've read John Clare's extended poem, The Parish, about the oppressive nature of the settlement laws for the poor, think of God is Love emblazoned over Oliver Twist's workhouse. You get the tensions that existed there. Parish welfare could be an appalling tyranny, and the landedness of the church, particularly during the enclosures, I might say, has rarely been good news for the poor. Nation, neighbourhood, and thirdly, nature. One of the earliest lessons every school child learns if they study geography is that you cannot separate out what is sometimes called physical geography. Actually, my daughter's taking geography for A-level. She's in her lower sixth and is just revising for her mocks at the moment, so it's fascinating to see how things have changed in the last 40 years since I was in her position. But that when I was taught geography at A-level, it was very much taught along parallel tracks, physical and human. Her teaching is much more integrated now, so that there is a recognition that one, of course, is shaped by the other. Each informs. There is no physical geography unshaped by human settlement. I live on Salisbury Plain. It looks bleak, it looks untenanted, it looks as if it's unchanged for thousands of years, but of course, the farming of sheep on that place, all kinds of ways in which it looks radically different. It's a deeply humanised landscape, just not very populous. The parish, through its early embedding in the land, in the early English field economy, through the payment of tithes, which lasted a staggeringly long time, 1,000 years. It's really only ended in the mid-19th century. For centuries, they were embedded as a way of making a deep kind of compact between the gift of the land and the life of the local church. There's been a deeply set association of the parish system with territorial belonging. And of course, questions of who, as soon as you ask questions of who belongs, you ask questions of who does not belong. We'll come to that as we conclude. This gives to the parish and to the parish church, I think, in concrete, a particular kind of imaginative heft as a symbol of settlement. We can think of myriad nostalgic depictions of the English church, especially in its rural manifestation, when scenes of the country are being summed up. What was I reading last night, and it cropped up again? I was reading The Lark Ascending, Richard, what's his name? I've forgotten the name of the author, but a wonderful book around landscape and identity. But he had that wartime poster of "Your Britain, fight for it now." You may have seen that poster with a parish church right in the middle of rolling shires. Its depiction, culturally, particularly at times of national crisis, has been formative. It has been a resort in many ways, not always positively either. It is interesting that ecologists and nature writers, particularly Richard Mabey, the work of the charity Common Ground, over the last 40 years, just as local history actually and social history has rediscovered parish studies in the last 40 years, ironically, and to my deep frustration, perpetually, just as the Church of England is calling into question the viability of such a system, ecologists and historians have kind of rediscovered it as a viable model of resilient local community. Because are we not seeking forms of community that can be little without being narrow, that can be little without being parochial, as it were, but being truly parochial in the original meaning of the term? Parish has become a vital word in ecological discussion around resilient communities, the transition town movement, and so on. There is something soily about parish, something soiled perhaps as well. But listen to this deeply nostalgic sentence from H.V. Morton's In Search of England. You might know the book, incredibly popular book in the 20th century. Right at the end, the final paragraphs, Morton writes this: "I went out into the churchyard where the green stones nodded together," you forgive the purple prose, "and I took up a handful of earth and felt it crumble and run through my fingers. Well," smiled the vicar, as he walked towards me through the yew trees, "that, I'm afraid, is all we have." "You have England," I said. I love that. I know it's hugely loaded with nostalgia. It's appalling in all kinds of ways, but I also love it. I love this idea of the handful of earth being a way of understanding the nation as a small route into seeing the whole, which I see at the heart of the work of the Victoria County history, as the small lens upon the broader aspect. It is a problematic view in all kinds of ways. It hitches our social imaginary to the rural over the urban again and again. It makes the idea of parish almost irredeemably nostalgic. I spent almost a chapter in my book, Parish, reckoning with nostalgia, because I think it's such, not because I think it's entirely unhealthy, I might say, but because I think it's incredibly powerful and often unrecognised to be such an engine of where we live, how we move, where we aspire, what our imagined communities, our ideal Jerusalems are. I think nostalgia is one of the great drivers of our polity nationally. Therefore, I think we need to understand it. First, it was coined for soldiers fighting in the French religious wars of the 18th century as a chronic condition for those who missed home. It's literally, as you will know, the longing for home. And the tendency for English and British imagination to veer between Arcadia and Eden at one pole and the heavenly Jerusalem in the other. We're constantly in tension between the two, it seems to me, in our poetry and in our politics too. And one of the problems of our current political situation is that we have lost a sense of faith in the future ideal home, and whether or not we believe in a heavenly Jerusalem, as Orwell said in the 30s, we've got to be children of God, even if the God of the prayer book doesn't exist. We've got to have some idealized view of the place we are seeking to attain and achieve, that is in the future and not just in the past. I've written quite a lot around lost villages, and particularly I'm interested in the lost villages of Wiltshire where I live. And one of the things as I've tried to trace those lines in fields and the humps and the lumps and the odd clues, perversely perhaps, I'm trying to also, I've been thinking, are there signs of lost villages of the future? So that our belonging is not just forever rooted in an imagined past, but is there an imagined future that we've also likewise lost, that we can proceed to? And I offer in conclusion that the parish is one way of conceiving of that future place if we return to its original meaning as the community for non-belongers. I'm constantly talking to local clergy, local community groups around this idea of a parish, not as the closed community, but the community for those who do not belong. How can we create communities, as I say, that are little without being narrow? Maybe there are lost villages of the future. Maybe we can be nostalgic for Jerusalem, not only Eden. If so, the parish, friends, could be just the place we need. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I don't have a mic. I left it at the back of the room. Can everyone hear me okay? If I kind of all of it. Thank you, Andrew, for an absolutely wonderful lecture. I had goosebumps, actually, doing some of that. So I feel we've been taken on this journey through history, psychogeography, politics, nostalgia, placemaking, imagination, ripples through time, belonging, unbelonging, that really rigorous engagement with the idea of the parish and the more challenging and tricky idea of the parochial. I'm definitely going to take away and reflect on that kind of the sort of three-pronged approach to the parish as nation, neighbourhood, nature. I love the way you called our attention to and sharpened our attention to that national imaginary that always begins with the local and the small and infer imaginaries or versions of identity that begin at the larger scale and work down. I love that question. Is it possible to be little without being narrow and parochial? The handful of earth that slips through our fingers, lost villages of the future. So many really provocative ideas to think with. Now, you're going to know the answer to this. I think it's Rogation Sunday this Sunday.
It's coming up. Yeah.
So
very timely.
maybe we could all be out there beating the bounds of our local parishes, perhaps with more resolution than Reverend Finch, who didn't do quite so well, and thinking maybe in place about some of the wonderful themes and questions and challenges that you have given us today. We thank Andrew again for that wonderful lecture. Now, Andrew has very kindly offered to take some questions, and we have a roving mic at the back of the room, courtesy of Adam Chapman, our VCH editor. So I will open up for questions now and invite questions from the floor. It looks like we have one right away at the front here.
Yes, thank you. You hinted during your talk about a difference between North and South. And then I got the impression that you said, well, they sort of progressively came closer together in the way that things were managed. What were the differences when the divide was there, if it might still exist? What were the differences between the two parts of the country? What prompted a more closer arrangement between the two parts? And when did that sort of change happen?
Such a good question, and there are huge gaps in my understanding here, so I'll only be able to give a partial answer. Parishes in the north, from the Midlands north, were larger, generally speaking, and often the persistence of other forms, definitions of place, because of course parish wasn't the only description of place. You had towns, villes, wards, all kinds of different descriptions of place that pertained, had less, it took less against other forms of local government in the northern communities. I'm surmising, and I don't really know, that that's partly due to the slightly freer form arrangements of monastic and church life that had to do with Celtic Christianity, which was always in tension with the more systematized Roman model, which was always more southern. But I think by the time you come to the English Reformation, that's pretty much evened out, because it was central to that programme, the Tudor, whether or not it was a revolution in government, the Tudor programme of government that actually became systematic and equal across the country. A very vague answer, and I need to find out more about that.
Thank you.
Others may know more, actually.
Can we invite any further questions for Andrew? And then at the front, I have one.
Many younger people live much of their lives online, and online they seek community and neighbourhood and a relationship. And I wonder if you think there's a future for a digital variant of the parish as a concept.
Yes. I thought about this, as we all did a lot during lockdown, which in one sense relocated us, parochialised us in one respect, and in another sense dislocated us. Very interesting, the paradox of what lockdown did, because as we discovered online community and meeting and work, at the same time we were delivering prescriptions to our neighbourhood, and we had WhatsApp groups for our street and so on, and there was the rediscovery of local species, and it was extraordinary the way the two lived together. And I do see that, even though so much of that has dissipated since, I do see that as a kind of hopeful indication of how it will be in the decades to come, where already, certainly in rural Wiltshire, we're seeing the quite rapid transformation of the village, because of the end of office working for many people, has meant that more professional people are now moving into rural communities. And so there's the adaptation of online community with its physical, with a physical neighbourhood, and the two may have absolutely nothing to do with one another, but one is actually helping the other to thrive in a new way. Particularly online life is helping village life to thrive. I'm involved at the moment, I won't say too much, but I'm involved at the moment with this role for church buildings nationally in looking at how churches can become flexible heritage office space for those who are now working from home and don't need an office but might like somewhere with a remarkable atmosphere and provenance to be in. That's one example of how I think online life is really promising for the future of physical community. Fascinating point.
There's a question. There's a couple. One in the second row. I have a question from Ruth.
Thank you so much. That's such a thought-provoking talk. And you spoke quite a lot about parish as a fundamentally rural concept, or at least it has those kind of evocations. And as someone who spends a lot of time working in an urban parish, I just wondered about your thoughts. You know, if you're thinking forward to parish as a potential ecological, social solution to some of our problems, fundamentally that does need to be urban in some ways. And so what your thoughts are about how it didn't work in the 19th century, but how might parish as a concept work in a 21st century city?
Yeah, brilliant. My research into parish was all done before I moved into a rural area and came out of the urban context and through working in South East London, and where the rediscovery of parish, both in civil terms, in civil politics, and in through the transition town movement ecologically, was proving really fruitful, really generative. And as you will be aware, certainly in London, there is a greater sense of village identity than there is in suburbia. Most people live in suburbia, of course, rather than urban or explicitly rural. But most people live in a sort of grey area between the two, and I've worked in there too. So I do think that the idea of parish does work. Even practices as eccentric as beating the bounds can be recovered as a means of discovering what one writer calls the fields beneath the urban landscape. And certainly, having worked in youth work with gangs in South East London, which have a tenacious territoriality. I mean, in my parish in Crystal Palace, we had two gangs, one uphill, one downhill, the boundaries of which would have put Reverend Finch to, those were policed just like those 1560s perambulations, nothing different, just as violent, just as difficult, and just as earthy, just as rooted. So I don't see any difference actually in the two. While the task practically might be different, it's just as local, there's just as much need for it. I found working for the regeneration of the parish in urban areas actually more enjoyable and more, in some ways, more fruitful than it has been in areas where there is already a very fixed version of what parochial might mean. And it's quite hard there to generate this sense of the community of non-belongers. Whereas in communities where many, if not most people, know they're not sure if they belong, there's quite a hunger for belonging, I've found.
Running as I do within 10 minutes walk of Churchyard in Crystal Palace, you've explained an awful lot about it, some of which I was aware of.
Give it my regards.
But I was interested to know if your 10 years sojourn as a parish priest in that area, was it that sort of fired your interest in the parish as a phenomenon?
It certainly crystallised it, but I'd grown up in in a rectory. So my father was a parish priest, his father before him, with an understanding of parish and a curious impressions of place from an early age of both belonging and not belonging. So in one sense, when you grow up in a vicarage, you know that you're right in the middle of a particular kind of community. You belong. And yet I also knew that it was a weird kind of belonging for plenty of others. And at school, it was weird. It was odd. It was liminal, geographically speaking, for your dad to be a vicar. So I was both at once on the margins of belonging and didn't belong. Actually, it felt I didn't belong in school. And yet at the same time at home, I was right in the middle of belonging. And I grew up with that sense of being, am I in the centre or am I at the margins? Well, I'm probably at the both. And I'd love to know what's going on there. And so, and then at theology, I studied as an undergraduate history and historical geography at Reading University, where there's such a lot of landscape study that goes on. And then when I studied theology in my late 20s, I was amazed that we were being taught to be local clergy, but nobody ever taught geography. And we were taught ecclesiastical history. We weren't taught ecclesiastical geography. And yet it was an entirely geographical job that we were going to do. And I made a real pain of myself, sort of suggesting, what's local? You know, I was genuinely wanting to, what do you mean? And so once I got ordained and went into the parish, I decided, well, if nobody, I'll do it. I need to find out. So it sprang from a number of stages along the way, but it was, but the experience of being in London was pretty formative. So, thank you.
I wonder, while the microphone is travelling, if I could be cheeky and take chair's privilege and ask a quick question. So, Andrew, this is something you touched on very briefly in your answer to one of the previous questions. But I'm thinking about your role as a lead for church buildings and cathedrals in the Church of England, and I can see your colleague, Emily G, in the room as well today. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how the conceptual work that you do and your thinking on the parish plays out in that role, and how it is embodied or it is applied in your approach to that role. If there's any more you can unpack for us.
Gosh, yes. Kind of needs a second lecture. Next time. It's been so interesting to take on this role in the last year, and yes, it does play out in all kinds of ways. And you know, Simon Jenkins has called this the heritage challenge of the 2020s. Church of England looks after 45% of the Grade 1 listed buildings in the country. It's just one church. It's not the whole. It's not all churches. The C of E looks after 45% of all the Grade 1 listed buildings in the country, ecclesiastical or not. It's a colossal estate, and it is at one of its critical points in terms of sustainability, in terms of institutional decline or recovery, and working through what needs to bottom out and what is picking up, what is the mixed usage that can actually, like with the online community, what could actually really be, could it be the germ of something really radically exciting and new, particularly around ecological work in communities. Thinking a lot about that at the moment. One of the things that I might just toss in that I learned from the past. I've gone to an old institution in an old country, and the institution is as old as the country almost. But curiously, quite short term in its thinking, given its long memory. One of the challenges is to learn from the patience of historic buildings. Not all of them are very ancient, of course, and there was a lot of overbuilding of churches. If you've ever read The Myth of the Empty Church, that great book, but there was a lot of overbuilding in the 19th century particularly. They were never full, lots of them, and so on. But there were periods at key points for the historic, and I've got a large number in Wiltshire. I look after 260 churches in Wiltshire, many of which are 800, 1,000 years old, so really old, Grade 1 listed buildings. And at key points in their histories, lots of them were pretty much closed. The roofs had fallen in, you know, after plague or war, or when the rector was riding to hounds in another county. you'd have the sheep walking in and out of the church for 20 years at a time, and you see on the lists of clergy, great gaps or question marks, And actually, one of the resilient things, one of the reasons we've still got them, is because we didn't tear them down or split them up or get rid. They just they went fallow for a while. And one of the things I'm trying to look into with our legislation at the moment is how we allow the same kind of patience that doesn't foreclose the future usage of churches, that in not even 5, but maybe 10, 20, 30 years' time, ecologically, certainly, things are going to be completely different. And so let's try and find ways of holding them without having to demand so much of them as an institution. I'm thinking particularly about Church of England, that allows for some of that historical patience to play out. But, and this is to your point, shared usage is key. So the parish church was always the original meeting place, secular and religious. And one of the most generative things I've ever done in church buildings is put on secular folk and rock gigs, art exhibition, political. There are a few things that you wouldn't do in a church, but and we can think what they might be, but there aren't that many. And actually, mixed usage, so that those for whom so many people think this threshold is of the church building, because I'm not religious, I don't belong. And part of what I'm trying to do is, along with other groups like the Churches Conservation Trust, say these are yours. They belong to the community, and it's the church's problem that it has given an impression that it's just a club for the religious, but this place is yours, and you can use it. And encouraging shared usage in creative ways. We only, services take up about 5% of the week, and we pay little tiny communities of octogenarians are sustaining medieval castles in every community, and our heroic volunteers are holding up these buildings, but it needs a broader social engagement. Simon Jenkins thinks there should be a reintegration with the parish council taking on the responsibility, giving the offer and a kind of bring back in the secular parish to help look after church buildings. That's discussed. But there's a lot more that could be said, and maybe next year we'll do it.
Okay. That's a beautiful, rich answer, and I love that idea of learning from the patience of historic buildings. I'm going to reflect on that. Adam, was the microphone travelling to another question? Oh, fantastic.
I've got it here. I have lived in urban and rural places, but I've spent nearly half my life now in a rural village, and I think we have the same potential problem with the village church as we do with the village school, that small is not seen as beautiful, that it's seen as less efficient. But as you say, I don't really think that fits with the idea that we shouldn't be travelling. We should, and that communities, it helps us to understand ourselves and to have a sense of identity. If the pace of closure of sort of rural facilities goes on like this, what do you think the lasting damage will be?
Loss of place. Loss of place in the broadest sense. I mean, place is such a broad word, isn't it? It's effective, it is social, it is there are different facets to it, but loss of place in the broadest sense, because as we know, if a community loses its memory, it is extremely, you can grow memory again, of course, and roots are always growing because people are arriving in communities all the time, and the soil is sort of gradually built up, constantly being grown and added to. But the loss of communal memory means loss of place, I would say, and I do, given that history is my first love, I would say that if you do that, you generally also you lose a sense of confidence in the future, and confidence with faith. You lose faith in the future if you lose your memory or trust in the past.
Yes,
also your critic.
I'd agree with you. Actually, our church is linked to 6 others, and one of them has been handed over with the Churches Conservation Trust.
Yeah,
and the effect has been to rip the heart out of that community, really. There's no love for the building. Now, the Church Conservation Trust seems to think that when a wall falls down in a Grade 1 listed building because they haven't checked it enough and nobody's airing, breathing, sort of, checking the building and using it, that the community will still pay for it. It falls on deaf ears because people now drive by and it's a sort of symbol of the failure of the church in that place. So I agree, but how do we persuade people in charge of the levers and the purse strings that this is important?
Well, I'm one of the levers. I'm by no means the only lever, but I am one of the levers, and I'm making decisions like that all the time. And as somebody who knows, who has the budgets to try and make it work, I know how difficult that is. You've got one of the other leaders here who's our Director of Church Buildings and Cathedrals for the Commission. So talk to us afterwards, please. Genuinely about that church. And there are some incredibly difficult decisions to be made around financing of these heritage buildings, but it is worth the trouble. Thank you.
And I think on that generous invitation to further discussion and conversation afterwards, we've worked very hard, Andrew, some really rich and thoughtful and provocative, again, answers to those questions, lovely thoughtful questions from the room as well. As I said, you're all invited to join us out on the mezzanine for drinks, for nibbles. There are some copies of Andrew's books, there's some BCH material for those of you who don't know our project, if you'd like to have a browse. Really, all that I want to do now is to say thank you to you again, Andrew, for a really wonderful lecture. Please join me